Carl Jung's answer to Job has established the story of Job as crucial to the psyche of modern man. The book of Job represents an individual ego's decisive encounter with the self, the greater personality. The ego is wounded by this encounter, which provokes a descent into the unconscious. In this video, we will look at William Blake's illustrations of the book of Job, published in 1825, through the Jungian lens. Blake's rendering of the Job story shows us the effect of this archetypal image on the unconscious of a modern or almost modern man. The first picture shows Job's initial state of prosperity and contentment. He and his family are gathered under the tree of life in a state of prayer. It is to be noted that the animals are asleep and the musical instruments are hanging on the tree. A state of innocence prevails. Both instinctual and the spiritual energies are not functioning. Job is living by the book as suggested by the open books in the laps of both Job and his wife. He is backed up by institutional religion, signified by the cathedral on one side, and his material well-being indicated by the flocks and barns on the other side. But the sun is setting and the moon is in its last phase. This shows the initial innocent stage of the ego that feels secure in its unconscious assumptions and collective containments. It is a state of participation mystic with surroundings and social groupings, family, community, church, etc. Above the picture are the first lines of the Lord's Prayer, "Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name," which suggests that it is an innocent, trusting Lord's Prayer attitude toward God, which is about to be sacrificed. The theme of sacrifice is indicated by the altar with the sacrificial fire at the bottom of the picture. The whole engraving of Job and his family is contained within a cloud of smoke rising from the altar, as though Job were the sacrificial victim. Inscribed on the altar are the words, "The letter killeth, the spirit giveth life," indicating that it is the word and Job's reliance on it which are to be sacrificed. The vast flocks of sheep emphasize the theme of sheep-like docility, collectivity, and innocence. In the lower part of the picture, Job seems to be reading and proclaiming the word of the book. Up above in heaven, something else is going on. The unconscious has been activated. Yahweh, like Job, has a book in his lap, as though he too had been functioning by the book. Also, many of the angels have books or scrolls, but now an intense dynamism approaches Yahweh. Satan, the autonomous spirit, manifests in a stream of fire. As the urge to individuation and greater consciousness, he stirs up doubts and questions which challenge the status quo and destroy the complacent living by the book. Yahweh and Satan plot to put Job to the test. The question is, will Job remain loyal to Yahweh in spite of adversity? It is as though Job has known only the benevolent aspect of Yahweh, and Yahweh needs to be known in his totality, good and bad. Hence, it is the self's need to be known in its totality, its opposites, by the ego, that initiates the drama of Job. In picture 3, the energy dynamism reaches its highest pitch. Almost pure explosive energy erupts into consciousness, destroying its containing structures. The picture shows the destruction of Job's children and their families. Job himself has not yet been touched. For him, the effects are still peripheral. Psychologically, this might correspond to the onset of bad dreams and neurotic symptoms in an individual, anxiety, depression, insomnia, and psychosomatic symptoms of all kinds. Dreams and atomic explosions, fires, floods, and catastrophes would correspond to this phase of the Job drama. Picture 4 shows the arrival of the bad news. There are messengers that are visible at different distances. In the direction from which they come can be seen a cathedral. This suggests that it is the established religious structure, the traditional container of transpersonal values, that is being destroyed by the energy erupting from the unconscious. In our picture, The fading cathedral in the distance is overshadowed by prominent megalithic Druidian forms in the foreground. There is thus a movement toward more primitive and less differentiated religious structures. This corresponds to the fact that an encounter with the unconscious does tend to break up merely formal habitual religious patterns and promotes a more vital, more primitive living connection with transpersonal realities. As the messengers arrive, Job and his wife look apprehensive. The symptoms of the activated unconscious are reaching awareness and the ego is alarmed. In this picture, Job has reacted to his symptoms by an intensified emphasis on the conventional virtues. He is shown here distributing alms, while in heaven, Satan is about to pour fire on him. Yahweh on his throne looks as hopeless as Job. Satan is in command of immense energies. Job's losses, servants, flocks, and family have fallen into the unconscious. The energy that have been lost to the conscious personality have increased the energy charge of the unconscious. This picture shows the way the ego often tries at first to deal with psychic symptoms. Rather than confront them and learn their meaning, it splits them off and dissociates them from consciousness. The net result is an impoverishment of the conscious personality, which can continue to function only with minimal energy and under severe limitations. Here, even the limited adaptation breaks down. The activated unconscious now pours itself directly onto Job, the ego. This is the picture of an acute breakdown. All defenses have collapsed. The picture shows Job being stricken with boil. In dreams, boils represent festering, neglected complexes that are erupting into consciousness. If the urgent need of the unconscious have been neglected, they are then apt to take on a negative pathological aspect and force the ego to give them attention by inflicting pain. Also, this is the last glimpse of the sun. It will not reappear until the final picture. Satan has 4 arrows in his right hand, with which he is about to pierce Job. This means that Job is being attacked by the quaternity, the wholeness of the self. The broken picture below the picture suggests that the ego as a container may break if more is poured into it than it can stand. The motif of the broken vessel is found in the Lurianic Kabbalah. According to this doctrine, the creation of the finite world required that the divine light be poured into bowls and vessels. Some of these bowls could not stand the impact of the light and broke, causing the light to spill. This picture suggests that Job is such a vessel. Like the Apostle Paul, Job could be called a chosen vessel to bear God's name. Job, in fact, did not break. His ego remained intact. He maintained his integrity and thus served as a vessel for the divine consciousness. This picture shows the arrival of Job's comforters, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. These 3 represent shadow figures who are brought into conscious view with the breakdown of the ego. As Job loses the defensive boundaries of his conscious personality, repressed aspects of himself come into view. Now in picture 8, Job succumbs to the nigredo, the dark night of the soul. He falls into blackness and suicidal despair. Job has been confronted with the ultimate metaphysical questions of existence. Once these questions have constellated, the individual must respond in one of 3 ways. Number 1. In despair at finding himself an orphan in the cosmos, he may commit suicide either literally or psychologically, for example, by succumbing to cynicism. Number 2. He may find containment in a community or creed that provides an adequate religious myth to silence the questions that have been raised. Number 3. The third possibility is that a numinous encounter with the self may occur, through which the individual is granted a direct experience of the archetypal reality that underlies conscious existence. Job's comforters are now talking to him. These figures can be best understood as personified images from the personal unconscious encountered in active imagination. Their remarks are a contaminated mixture of several elements of differing values which are characteristic of active imagination and which call for an active critical attitude on the part of the ego. This picture illustrates a particular speech of Eliphaz. Now I have had a secret revelation. A whisper has come to my ears at the hour when dreams master the mind and slumber lies heavy on man. A shiver of horror ran through me, and my bones quaked with fear. A breath slid over my face, the hairs of my body bristled. Someone stood there. I could not see his face, but the form remained before me. Silence, and then I heard a voice. Was ever any man found blameless in the presence of God, or faultless in the presence of his Maker? This must have been a numinous dream of Job's, which is being recalled in his active imagination. It is a kind of dream prelude to the later full encounter with Yahweh. In this picture, Job is the victim of a barrage of accusation from his so-called comforters. Since he is convinced of his innocence and unconscious of his shadow, the personal unconscious compensates by criticizing him. A good case can be made for the idea that Job is inflated and needs awareness of his shadow as provided by the cynicism of his comforters. This type of reductive understanding is suitable for the young and promotes ego development while minimizing the importance of the unconscious. However, it misses the main point of the book of Job. It is essential that Job do not succumb to the personalistic interpretations of his counselors. If he were to decide that his misfortunes were all his own fault, he would prevent the possibility of a manifestation of the numinosum. The ego vessel would be broken, would lose its integrity, and could have no divine manifestation poured into it. By holding fast to its own experience as an authentic center of being, the Job ego brings about the visible manifestation of the other, the transpersonal center. This picture illustrates Job's remark, "If I say my bed will comfort me, my couch will soothe my pain, you frighten me with dreams and terrify me with visions." Yahweh's double nature is here portrayed in frightful fashion. He is entwined by a great snake and a cloven hoof is visible. Yahweh's right hand points to the tablets of the law, and his left hand points to hell, which has opened up and threatens to engulf Job. Job here stares into the abyss, the negative numinosum. We are reminded of Jung's remark that the horrified perception of the reality of evil has led to at least as many conversions as the experience of good. Whereas previously Satan has been associated with fire, now Yahweh himself has taken on that attribute and points to hell as one of his own manifestations. In the marriage of heaven and hell, Blake says that the Jehovah of the Bible is no other than he who dwells in flaming fire. Yahweh and Satan have now become one. As Jung tells us, one aspect of God is a seething lake of fire. To live by the book protects one from that fire, unless or until the satanic eye of Yahweh is activated and sets off another performance of the drama of Job. Here a new man, a fourth one previously unmentioned, enters the picture, Elihu. A change of psychic atmosphere is indicated by the presence of stars for the first time. It is as though Job's encounter with the abyss has caused a change. The fourth figure signifies the emergence of Job's totality. Elihu is a young man who begins by saying, "I am still young and you are old, so I was shy, afraid to tell you what I know. I told myself, old age should speak, advancing years will utter wisdom. But now I know that it is a breath in man, the inspiration of Shaddai, that gives discernment." Elihu is the young and fresh aspect of the psyche, the undeveloped function, the child, that which is closest to the unconscious. It is this figure which is the harbinger of the self. Elihu's remarks present many of the same ideas that Yahweh will soon express more forcefully. Particularly noteworthy are Elihu's statements about dreams. God speaks first in one way and then in another, but no one notices. He speaks by dreams and visions that come in the night, when slumber comes on mankind, and men are all asleep in bed. Then it is he whispers in the ear of man, or may frighten him with fearful sights to turn him away from evil doing and make an end of his pride, to save his soul from the pit and his life from the pathway to Sheol. Now finally, the full nomination manifest. Yahweh appears to Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this obscuring my designs with his empty-headed words? Brace yourself like a fighter. Now it is my turn to ask questions and yours to inform me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me, since you were so well informed, who decided the dimensions of it? Do you know? Or who stretched the measuring of line across it? What supports its pillars at their bases? Who laid its cornerstone when all the stars of the morning were singing with joy and the sons of God in chorus were chanting praise? Who pent up the sea behind closed doors when it leapt tumultuous out of the womb, when I wrapped it in a robe of mist and made black clouds its swaddling bands? When I marked the bounds it was not to cross and made it fast with a bolted gate? Come thus far, I said, and no further. Here your proud waves shall break. The distinction between the ego and the self is here presented with stunning force. Job is discovering the autonomy of the psyche. Jung writes, Job is challenged as though he himself were a god, but in the contemporary metaphysics there was no other god except Satan. In his stead, God must set up his miserable servant as a bugbear whom he has to fight. The conflict becomes acute for Yahweh as a result of a new factor. The new factor is something that has never occurred before in the history of the world. The unheard of fact that without knowing it or wanting it, a mortal man is raised by his moral behavior above the stars in heaven, from which position of advantage he can behold the back of Yahweh, the abysmal world of surds. Now what does Jung mean by Job's moral behavior? It is nothing but Job's refusal to accept responsibility for events that he knows he did not cause. Job's intellectual honesty, his loyalty to his own perception of reality, his integrity in maintaining the distinction between subject and object, between man and God, all this go to make up Job's moral behavior, which has forced God to reveal himself. Job's encounter with Yahweh in the whirlwind taught him a basic lesson. In his innocence, like orthodox theologians of all creeds, Job has assumed that God's reality must correspond to his conception of it. The living experience shatters that assumption. The numinosum experience continues in a more structured form. At first, Yahweh had appeared as an undifferentiated energy phenomenon, the whirlwind. Now in this picture, a structured universe is revealed in an image of totality. In the heavenly realm, we see a numerical series of 1, 2, and 4, represented by Yahweh as 1, Apollo and Artemis as 2, and the 4 angels as 4. Even more important is the fact that this is an image of creation. It is most interesting that an image of world creation should appear at this point. A passage in the alchemical emerald tablet of Hermes says that at the end of the recipe comes the phrase, "Thus the world has been created." The alchemist considered the creation of the philosopher's stone, the goal of the opus, as equivalent to the creation of the world. Job's torturous ordeal is analogous to the ordeal imposed on the prima materia in the alchemical vessel. In each case, out of the ordeal, a world is born. It is as though Job's encounter with Yahweh in his raw, undifferentiated form were a conception, a process of fertilization that brings about a new creation. The alchemist spoke of the prima materia as an increatum, matter that has not yet undergone the process of creation. Job's encounter with Yahweh in his uncreated form seems to have the effect of initiating a new creation. This corresponds to the effect we observe when the ego meets the unconscious, the undifferentiated prima materia of the psyche. Here we have the infernal aspects of the numinosum as Behemoth and Leviathan. This is the other side of the numinosum, which we must always remember is a union of opposites. In the previous picture, Job was below, looking up at creation as manifested in the heavens. In this picture, he is above, surrounded by stars, looking down at the inhabitants of the abyss. He has temporarily risen above his biological being and is looking down at it. Yahweh is saying, "Behold Behemoth, which I made as I made you. Can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down his tongue with a cord?" Job is being shown the abysmal aspect of God and the depths of his own psyche, which contains devouring monsters remote from human values. Behemoth and Leviathan represent the primordial monstrosity of being. God reveals his own shadow side, and since man participates in God as the ground of his being, he must likewise share his darkness. To this, Jung writes, "Formerly Job was naive, dreaming perhaps of a good God or of a benevolent ruler and just judge. He had imagined that a covenant was a legal matter and that anyone who was party to a contract could insist on his rights as agreed, that God would be faithful and true, at least just, and one could assume from the 10 Commandments would have some recognition of ethical values or at least feel committed to his own legal standpoint. But to this horror, he has discovered that Yahweh is not human, but in certain respects less than human, that he is just what Yahweh himself says of Leviathan. Unconsciousness has an animal nature. Like all old gods, Yahweh has his animal symbolism with its unmistakable borrowings from the much older theriomorphic gods of Egypt, especially Horus and his 4 sons. Of the 4 animals of Yahweh, only one has a human face. That is probably Satan, the godfather of man as a spiritual being. Ezekiel's vision attributes 3/4 animal nature and only 1/4 human nature to the animal deity, while the upper deity, the one above the sapphire throne, merely had the likeness of a man. This symbolism explains Yahweh's behavior, which from the human standpoint is so intolerable. It is the behavior of an unconscious being who cannot be judged morally. Yahweh is a phenomenon, and as Job says, not a man. This picture comes not from the book of Job, rather illustrates a remark of Jesus, "I watched Satan fall like lightning from heaven." According to Jung, Yahweh became aware of his lack of moral differentiation through meeting Job and therefore had to give satisfaction to Job by incarnating in Christ. This involved at the same time a decisive separation of Yahweh and Satan, represented by Satan's being cast out of heaven. Psychologically, it indicates a decisive separation of the opposites. A division is occurring between Yahweh and Satan and between Job and his shadow figures. A full synthesis has not been achieved, but rather a higher level of differentiation. Job's relation to Yahweh has now been healed. The ego's rapport with the self, the ego-self axis, has been restored. In the lower margin, Blake quotes the saying of Christ in John 14:20, "At that day you shall know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you." This quotation states explicitly that Job is reconciled to Yahweh through Christ, the same point that Jung makes in answer to Job. In other words, Yahweh's encounter with Job has required Yahweh to undergo the Christian transformation. Although Job is reinstated in Yahweh's good graces, all elements of the personality do not share in the restoration. Job's friends have their backs to Yahweh and seem to be banished from his blessing. This indicates that the shadow remains in repression and full integration remains for future. This picture illustrates the attitude brought about by Job's encounter with Yahweh. He is facing inward and offering a burnt sacrifice to Yahweh. What is pictured here is thus a sacrificial attitude. To this, Jung says, in his great final speech, God reveals himself to Job in all his frightfulness. It is as if he said to Job, "Look, that's what I am like. This is why I treated you like this." Through the suffering which he inflicted upon Job out of his own nature, God has come to this self-knowledge and admits, as it were, this knowledge of his frightfulness to Job. And that is what redeems Job. This is really the solution of the enigma of Job, that is, a true justification for Job's fate, which without this background would in its cruelty and injustice remain an open problem. Job appears here clearly as a sacrifice, but also as the carrier of the divine fate, and that gives meaning to his suffering and liberation to his soul. Job is sacrificed for Yahweh's developing consciousness. At first, he is an involuntary victim. After the theophany, when he sees the reality of Yahweh with his own eyes, he takes on the attitude of voluntary sacrifice. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees thee. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job's comforters are no longer separated from him. The sacrificial attitude brings unity to the personality as ego, shadow figures, and wife anima turn toward the center which they serve and which unites them. This picture shows his family and friends each bringing him money and a gold ring. This expresses the unification of the personality. Money signifies libido, and this is now becoming available to the ego from all the various aspects of the psyche. A ring signifies unity, wholeness, and the marriage pledge. That is, it is an emblem of the conjunctio, the union of opposites in the psyche. A field of ripe grain is in the background. These fruits of the ordeal are now to be harvested. Job's fortunes have not only been restored, but there has also been an enlargement of the personality as a result of the encounter with the numinosum. As Jung puts it, the widening of consciousness is at first upheaval and darkness, then a broadening out of man to the whole man. Here Job is instructing his daughters. Scenes of his encounter with Yahweh are in the background. It is interesting that the feminine factor is given special prominence at the end. The three daughters are mentioned as particularly beautiful and given equal inheritance rights, something very unusual for the time. Job's newly established relation to his daughters correspond to what Jung says happened to Yahweh after his encounter with Job. He remembered his playmate Sophia, a feminine being who is no less agreeable to him than to man, a friend and playmate from the beginning of the world. Yahweh had treated Job in a shockingly unrelated way. His feminine side has been missing and must be recovered, as it is here with Job. The book of Job concludes with these words: Yahweh restored Job's fortunes because he had prayed for his friends. More than that, Yahweh gave him double what he had before, and all his brothers and all his sisters and all his friends of former time came to see him and sat down at table with him. They showed him every sympathy and comforted him for all the evils Yahweh had inflicted on him. Each of them gave him a silver coin and each a gold ring. Yahweh blessed Job's new fortune even more than his first one. He came to own 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 sea-donkeys. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. His first daughters he called Turtle Dove, the second Cassia, and the third Mascara. Throughout the land there were no women as beautiful as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them inheritance rights like their brothers. After his trials, Job lived on until he was 140 years old and saw his children and his children's children up to the fourth generation. Then Job died, an old man and full of days. The final picture shows Job, his wife, and new family gathered around the tree of life once again, under new and different circumstances. It is dawn, the sun is rising on the right. On the left is the moon in its waxing phase. Previously, all had been sitting, now they are standing. The animals are awake instead of asleep, and the musical instruments are being played. A rejuvenation of life is here represented following the dark night of Job's encounter with the unconscious. He is now in a conscious relation to the reality of the self, that is Yahweh, to instinctual energies, the animals, and to the spiritual, creative, and feeling factors, that is the musical instruments. And most important of all, Job is now aware of being the carrier of the divine faith, and that gives meaning to his suffering and liberation to his soul. As in the first picture, here again is the flaming sacrificial altar. Again, the picture is framed by the cloud of smoke rising from that altar, and again a tent-like form surrounds them all, as though the picture were a window looking into the holy tabernacle. The lesson of the Job story for modern man is described by Jung in his letter of June 30, 1956 to a friend who had asked for an answer to the problem of an unconscious, ignorant creator God. Jung replies, "We have become participants of the divine life and we have to assume a new responsibility, that is, the continuation of the divine self-realization, which expresses itself in the task of our individuation. Individuation does not only mean that man has become truly human as distinct from animals, but that he is to become partially divine as well. This means practically that he becomes adult, responsible for his existence, knowing that he does not only depend on God, but that God also depends on man."